After publishing my initial talk about how to write an essay about 2 years ago, there's been endless comments. Can you give us an example of how to write an essay? And I've always been cautious about this because any example automatically rules out any other approach, and I really wanted to encompass as many different ways of writing essays as possible. But I think in this particular case we're going to try and write an essay, partly because I've been teaching to younger chaps something about history, and one of them in particular has been looking at the development of the London sewerage system by a man called Getty. And this was something that happened after the Great Stink, and people were terribly frightened of the spread of cholera, which they thought was spread by a miasma. They were wrong. It was spread by water, and coincidentally the development of the sewerage system pretty well wiped out the cholera epidemic. Now, at about the same time, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died apparently of typhoid. We now probably suspect that it was cancer. But that combination of the sewerage system and therefore the development of running water, and anxiety about typhoid, and an interest in hygiene, developed an obsession among the British with the toilet. Now, the terminology is difficult to pinpoint and tie down because we have many words for this particular object. But in the process of my research into the Getty sewers, I discovered a fascinating question. And the question is, the toilet is the most important invention of the modern era. What a bizarre question. Now, is it true? And how would we go about answering that question or producing a suitable essay to deal with this? Let me please reassure you, this is not a very serious subject, unless, of course, you happen to be a Victorian and on the receiving blast of one of these exploding toilets that didn't have a proper S-bend. So, as a dutiful student of this system, the first thing I am going to do, and one of the things which is going to control my research, is to focus on that paragraph which will form the crunch. Now, my instinct is that the toilet is indeed one of the most important inventions that we have. I'm not completely convinced that it's modern. Let's have a look at this in detail. The person who sticks out for the invention of the modern toilet is a man called Thomas Crapper. Thomas Crapper, whose name is only coincidentally related to the stuff that one might put into the toilet. Thomas Crapper was born in York. He's a thorough Englishman and really a bit of a thorough scoundrel, because although he had a number of patents taken out in his own name by the end of the 19th century, the thing that he was famous for, which was the S-bend, which uses a little bit of water to trap foul smells coming back up from the sewerage system, and to speed up and reduce the amount of water used when flushing. This was not, it seems, his invention. This belonged and was patented by a man called Albert Giblin in 1897, though Crapper was certainly marketing something that seems like Gibbon's invention in the 1880s. Now, if we go back, we find that the S-bend seems to have been developed mostly by Alexander Cummins in 1775, so even before the 19th century. And it's the popularising of this S-bend which sorts out the problem of gases coming back up the toilet system and exploding in the bathroom and killing quite a lot of people. Very many Victorians died as a result of an explosion in the loo. But we can take the story of the flush action lavatory much further back. We can take it back to a Kurdish gentleman in 1206 called Al-Jazari. And Al-Jazari seems to be responsible for the flush action loo. He is not responsible for the idea of linking water as a way of getting rid of solids. That indeed you can trace right back to the Romans and maybe even further back. There are stories that you can go back for 4,000 years. The Minoans had flush action loos in Akrotiri, and Michael Hoogan identified flushing loos in Knossos. But certainly in Hadrian's Wall there's a little place called Vindolanda where you can find evidence of loos which seem to have some sort of flushing mechanism. But Alexander Cummins is pretty well responsible for that S-bend, and the Great Exhibition in 1851 is responsible for popularising this, as indeed is Crapper, and these people together are responsible for that mechanised flush action. Two other regal points. One, Queen Elizabeth I had a man design a water closet which was operated manually, but seems to involve some sort of flushing device, and that was designed by a man called John Harrington. And John Harrington gives his name to the John, which is popular in Australia as a euphemism for the toilet. John Harrington's loo was called the Ajax, and Queen Elizabeth I was apparently a little bit frightened of using it because the water flushing mechanism was very noisy, and all her courtiers would immediately know that she'd been spending time in that room. The other queen is Victoria herself, who demanded a flush action loo to be installed in a palace she was visiting in Germany. And probably this popularised the invention on the continent. Now, Marie Antoinette also had her own water closet in Versailles, which, like Victoria, would have been privy to her alone, but unlike the Victorian invention, was probably life-threatening. Now, that should give me enough to write the crunch, even if I have to prevaricate a bit to explain that although this is a great invention, it may not necessarily be a thoroughly modern invention. What seems to be thoroughly modern, and what I think I would emphasise in my crunch, are the modifications to the toilet system that make it safe and that make it popular. Having established the crunch, and that is all I would do in my plan, I would only write about the crunch. Now I need to settle down and write the essay itself. I would start with my introduction, which would be brief. I would bear in mind the fact that the question uses the word toilet. Maybe I would question that use of the word, because toilet is a relatively modern term which came in, as far as I can gather, because the trains initially had two little rooms for the convenience of their passengers. One room was a wash basin, and the other room was an early version of the water closet. When these two rooms were combined, the train companies retained the euphemism for the washroom, the toilet or toilette, and lost the WC. This popularized the word toilet as a euphemism for the flush action commode. Now, there are so many words to describe the toilet: lavatory, loo, toilet, John, Jakes, the head, which of course refers to the front of a ship where people would relieve themselves. Now, in the introduction, I would simply use maybe one or two sentences to indicate that I was concerned that, that there were other inventions that may require consideration, and that this statement is quite a grand statement and a provocative statement. My arguments for the proposition that the toilet is the most important invention of the modern era would focus on the big stink itself, would make reference to the miasma, and maybe to Basil Getty's development of the sewerage system. I think I would also want to take in the general climate of improved sanitation, which would give me an opportunity to talk about Florence Nightingale and her link with the Crimean War, and also the developments in modern surgery. Arguments against. These would come in two parts, and I would be very clear that my third paragraph is going to be slightly longer than I would normally want it to be. In fact, I might even subdivide my third paragraph, because there seem to be two arguments against the proposition. The first is that there are many inventions in the modern era which call out to be considered more important than the toilet. The atomic bomb, or atomic power in general. That surely is something we would consider terribly important in the modern era. Locomotion in general. We could think of trains and we can think of cars. We could even perhaps make a case for the bicycle. The bicycle is more important than the toilet. And the third point maybe I would raise would be the idea of vaccination. But that might indeed cover all forms of medical developments that we've had in the modern era. Part two would be an argument that the toilet is not, in fact, a modern invention at all. Now, we've already touched on some of these issues, that it goes back 4,000 years. So I would use some of those points to emphasize a case against the toilet. I would possibly, just possibly, set up the idea that what is important about the loo in the 19th century are the developments and modifications that are made to it that make it safe and popular. That indeed would form the basis of my conclusion when I finished my crunch. Now, as I say, this is in some ways a slightly light-hearted topic, but I think it serves to demonstrate how we can construct an essay around the knowledge that we've got. We start with the crunch, we go up to paragraphs 2 and 3, we try and sort out a suitable introduction, and the conclusion automatically follows from what we say in the crunch.